to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or you allowing your politics to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orlin Johnson, and let me introduce you to our roundtable of regularly scheduled panelists. We have with us today Mr. Todd McFarland, who's the Associate General Counsel for the General Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We have Mr. Tim Schultz, who's the President of the First Amendment Partnership, a nonpartisan organization dedicated to protecting religious freedom for all. We have Dr. Lawrence Brown, who's here with us, who's the Assistant Director of Public Affairs and Religious Liberty for the Northeastern Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And we have Dr. Timothy Golden, who's with us, who's a professor of philosophy at Walla Walla University. Gentlemen, thanks for being here with us, but let's go ahead and get started. I wanted to talk about this thing that's called Chaplain Hill. There's a particular location at Arlington Cemetery that they call it Chaplain Hill. It's a place where chaplains have been buried, but there was some concern that there shouldn't be a specific area for chaplains and that maybe we were getting too much religion intertwined into Arlington Cemetery. What do you guys think about that?
Yeah, Orlin, this is an area I think a lot of people aren't familiar with, but there is a particular part of Arlington Cemetery where it's filled up now, but chaplains had been buried that were eligible. And at the top of that, there had been some monuments, right? And on that was listed all of the chaplains who had died in the line of service throughout the different wars. Interestingly, and this was the chaplain's choice, they are segregated. There's one Catholic, one Protestant, one Jewish, which I think is an interesting choice, but that was the decision that was made many years ago. And those monuments over time had started to crumble, right? They were made and needed some updating. And the folks running Arlington Cemetery really seemed uninterested in remodeling them or rehabbing them. And so there actually had to be an act of Congress to go in and to give control to a different organization to remodel those. And there's very strict limits on what they can do. They can't turn this into some big thing. It has to keep the same footprint and they have to get permission for certain things.
Right.
But it was an interesting situation where Arlington Cemetery really was interested in having any religious expression in Arlington Cemetery.
So what do we do about this? Should there be religion in Arlington Cemetery? What do you guys think?
Well, I think...
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Dr. Brown. I'm sorry. I'll defer to you.
I was just going to point out that there is, going so far back, a clear role, a clear connection between what the chaplaincy has done for the men and women in the military. It's almost ludicrous to try and argue that this is somehow anathema or somehow problematic. The fact is, today, even corporate America has seen wisdom in having a chaplaincy entity as part of what they do. And so I think folks who want to fight about this probably need to go find something else to fight about.
But I don't think this is about chaplains so much. I think it's a point of, listen, we don't have a special area for Rangers and a special area for Navy SEALs. Why separate out anything specially for the chaplains? They're serving in the military just like anybody else. What do you guys think?
Well, first of all,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. Well, first of all, remember, they're not serving like everyone else, right? They are non-combatants. Chaplains have a special role, a special place in there, and there are sections that are dedicated, usually sort of by time and so forth, but people of certain wars have been dedicated in certain areas and so forth. So there are distinctions made, and there are, of course, monuments to different groups and so forth in Arlington. So I don't think what was happening with the chaplains is that much different than what Arlington has done generally. I'm sorry, Dr. Golden.
Oh, no, that's fine, Todd, no problem. I will say that I think Todd makes an interesting point here because the chaplain's role is so unique and it is so special, and they do tend to touch lives of soldiers in a very significant way spiritually. I, for one, think that it's just a way of sort of recognizing the unique role of chaplains, even in death, right? So they're designated as chaplains, even as they rest in their graves. And I think that is a perfectly legitimate way to recognize the service that they've rendered.
Tim Schultz, what do you think?
Yeah, I kind of just agree with the consensus here. I mean, I think that this is standard. It's been done for a long time. Military chaplains go back before the Revolutionary War. They were in Washington's army. We've had chaplains. They've been very important, as Dr. Golden said. I think recognizing them alongside other special contributors in our military is entirely appropriate. And I think you'd get the vast majority of people, even secular people who have served in the military, to say the same thing.
You know what was
and I would also like to say that I think their families, right, their surviving family members would be people who would appreciate that special recognition as well.
Well, I think one issue, though, that's kind of interesting here is the idea that they actually got legislation passed that was bipartisan. They got both sides of the aisle to agree that this chaplain component must stay there when you got a Congress that never agrees on anything. So that was about as shocking as I could imagine. I mean, Todd, we were blown away.
Yeah, it was. I mean, you know, the military has a lot of connections with Congress, right? There's a lot of veterans there. Congress appropriates them a lot of money, military leaders. And when they were having problems there, you know, with the leadership at Arlington, and they said, well, I guess we'll just have to get an act of Congress passed, and got it passed in a matter of months. I'm just like, remind me to never get on the bad side of chaplains. These are people that can throw some serious political weight when they need to on Capitol Hill.
Well, I think the appreciation for what's going on in the military from a faith perspective is very solid, and we can be clear on the fact that no matter where you stand on this issue, members of Congress were on board as well. I want to talk about something else that I found kind of interesting. There was a matter that went up that we started to see where there's now some questions regarding how you actually have to speak to people. They have certain ways that they would like for you to do so, certain pronouns they would like for you to use. And we have a matter that actually took place where there was an individual who refused to engage in the utilization of those pronouns, and they were summarily pretty much dismissed and told, well, you can no longer be a part of what's going on here. What are we talking about when we get to a point where your failure to use certain pronouns are putting us in a position where now people may have to determine whether or not they're going to continue to work someplace? What do you guys think about that?
It really comes down to the venue, you know, and there are some venues where I think it would be very problematic to take that stance, but there are some venues where I think it would be very problematic not to take that stance, given the variety of people that flow through there. So I really think it comes down to what venue are you talking about?
So there are a lot of competing principles here. One of them is that when you're talking about a public school teachers generally don't have the same First Amendment rights that they would in their official role as a public school teacher as they do as a private actor, right? It's just speaking as John or Jane Q. citizen. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that the use of pronouns does contain a kind of quasi-theological, certainly a philosophical construct that many people disagree with. Now, that doesn't, by the way, mean that they shouldn't do it. It just means that people that are objecting to it are saying, there is a philosophical presupposition under your request that I use a particular pronoun, and it's a philosophical presupposition that I don't agree with. So that's really where the controversy comes from. Now, that doesn't answer how we adjudicate these cases, especially when you talk about name changes, right? That is also another issue that I think is analogous and that I think that we also could talk about. But there are different cross-cutting principles here, and that is why I think these cases aren't as easy as they sometimes look.
Well, I guess a big question, though, is that if I'm in a position, even as a school teacher, and I decide I don't want to utilize pronouns, the idea of saying that the utilization thereof may mean I subscribe to certain things that I don't subscribe to. And from a religious standpoint, that may be a problem. Todd, what do we do about that?
You know, I think this is, you know, as Tim said, it's a very difficult situation because I mean, it is a request. I mean, it is a desire to get the person to embrace a certain ideology, right? To in fact, that's the whole point. Is like these people, the trans individuals need to be validated. They need to be, to not be misgendered is the terms that have been created and all this. And so it's not just a matter of preference, right? I mean, you call me Todd, because that's my name and that's what I've represented it. And if I change it, you'd probably, if I'd gone by a different name, my middle name is Robert, and I asked you to call me Robert, you'd probably do that because there's no underlying theological or philosophical component there.
Right.
There is with this, and it is very clear the trans community wants those pronouns used, not just because of the person's preference, but so that people will validate the decision that the trans individuals have made and the fact that you can transition your gender. And it's not a matter of biology, but a matter of how people feel. And I think when you start compelling that kind of speech, it becomes problematic. Yes, teachers and other government employees don't enjoy the full First Amendment rights, but they do when it's a matter of public policy, when it's a matter of national importance. And these are that. And so I think it's a difficult situation. And, I think a lot of times this could probably be handled by maybe the student goes to a different classroom, or maybe the teacher just doesn't use pronouns with this student. But, let's be very clear about this. This is just not simply about a preference on a name. It is about embracing a particular worldview. And that's the point of it.
Well, it's interesting because when I listen to Todd and to Tim, I agree with them that what the folks in the trans community want is a recognition of a certain a worldview or a certain endorsement of how they live as trans people. But I think this could end up backfiring because from a philosophical standpoint, I may reject the presupposition you're asking me to embrace and still use the pronoun that you want me to use, in which case I'm now saying something that I don't mean, and I'm completely at odds with the goal that you have in mind. So this could, as complex as it is, we could end up having a situation that backfires on the trans community because you have people sort of giving them what they want in a kind of boilerplate perfunctory way without adhering to anything that you actually want them to adhere to. I think that's another possibility here that we have to explore that could end up backfiring on them.
Well, that's the question. Should it be forced on somebody? Dr. Brown, should it be forced on you to go down that road?
Well, at the end of the day, you got to remember, ideology, you can't make somebody believe a certain way or feel a certain way. You just can't do it. And that's why my venue argument comes up again, because there are just some settings where I may think or feel a certain way, but if I'm going to operate in a particular setting, I've got to be able, well, you know what it brings to mind? It brings to mind the county clerk whose job it is to record the marriage license. You may or may not believe a certain thing, but your particular job calls for you to do a certain thing, and no one's asking you to change how you feel or change how you believe. They're simply saying, this is your assignment, and in this public domain, you either have to fulfill that assignment or you have to say, you know what, I'm not comfortable doing this. Please assign me someplace else to work.
And I can fulfill that assignment in a clerical, perfunctory, boilerplate way and completely reject the substance of what you want me to accept. And the question, I think, for folks in the trans community is, do you want to live in a world surrounded by people who say things that they don't mean?
Right.
I think,
do you want to inhabit a world in which the substance of what you want to be accepted is wholeheartedly rejected, but sort of placated and tolerated with this kind of politically correct wordplay? Is that what you really want?
Okay, I know Todd has a point he wants to make, and I don't want to cut him off, but let me say this. As a Black man living in America, I have made my peace with the fact that no matter how positive my contribution, no matter how nice a guy I am, and I think most of you know I'm a nice guy, I have made my peace with the fact that there are some people in this country who are never going to like me because I am a Black man in America. But you know what I say to that? like me, don't like me, I can't do a lot about that. But how you treat me, okay, that one we better get straight. Otherwise, we're gonna have a problem. And at the end of the day, sometimes it just is gonna come down to how we treat a person as opposed to how we feel about a person.
Well, I think there's a difference between race and the transgender community. With all due respect, Dr. Brown, I think there's a big difference there. But I'm sorry.
But well, I was going to say, but proving that I am a smart person, Dr. Brown made the point I was going to make. In fact, I mean smart. I agreed with him. But yeah, I think that's what they're looking for is, just, you don't have to agree to this, but, you're going to have to, and it also has an impact on what they believe, right? What people say over time can definitely have an impact on what they say. I do see a little bit of a difference, though, between a county clerk that processes a marriage license, does that sort of in the back. It's a one-time event, right? You don't really interact with that person, and a teacher calling a student by, a pronoun that does not match up their biology day after day.
Well, it is different. I think that every analogy is going to be a little bit imperfect. I mean, I think we could also think of the analogy of a school teacher who's, their student in 1960s in New York is named Lou Alcindor, and the student says, "I'd like to change my name to Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. I am converting to Islam." Of course, that happened later, not when he was in high school. The teacher might say, "I think Islam is a false religion, and I'm not going to call you by your new name. I'm going to call you by your name, Lou Alcindor, your Christian name," right? And so you can imagine a teacher saying that, and we would say, "Well, you're a public school teacher. You have a job to call the teacher by, or the student by, his or her preferred name." I'm not saying even if that's a perfect analogy. I'm just saying your rights as a public school teacher are more circumscribed. You would have a right as a public citizen to call Kareem or Lou Alcindor, whatever you would want him to, right? You could go to a basketball game and call him all kinds of names, and that doesn't violate that. You have a freedom to do that. But as a public school teacher, your rights are less than they are as a private citizen.
And I think that's right on point, that as a public school teacher puts you in a different position, but it's also putting you in an awkward position when, as Todd is mentioning, you have to do this over and over and over again, and it's something that kind of grates against what you might be personally believing from a religious standpoint. Well, let's take a look at another issue that we wanted to talk about. There was a case out there that's called the Apache stronghold. We have actually some indigenous ground that the Apaches were looking at to be something that was sacred for them, a place where they had some burial ground activities happening, and other things that were important to them from a spiritual perspective. Then you have private organizations and entities that are getting government approvals to be able to start mining for copper mines there. Now, I got to tell you, I understand that we want to be progressive. I understand that we have a private sector that wants to go out and get involved in mineral rights and things of that nature. But when you start to step on the indigenous grounds and you start to engage in an activity where you are clearly violating an area that may be deemed to be spiritual for a specific group of individuals, do we actually have a position where we can say that's gone too far and we should do something a little bit different? What do you guys think about that?
Well, I would just say that from a moral standpoint, putting aside my legal hat and putting on my philosopher hat, this is just way out of bounds, right? I mean, we as lawyers, we all know that the law tells us, the law can only tell us what's legal, but our conscience tells us what's right.
Right.
And from a moral standpoint, this should, I think, jump off the page at all of us and scream that this is a problem. You're talking about a private entity going on to indigenous land to mine that land for profit to get money in a way that sort of completely overlooks the religious traditions and histories of the Apache people, not to mention the framing of it as an Apache stronghold, as if the Apache people are the ones applying some sort of stronghold, when it would seem to be this private company that's applying a stronghold to the Apache people. So from a moral standpoint, this is just a serious problem. I'll leave it up to the others to talk about some of the legal issues.
Yeah, but Tim, let me ask you this though. I mean, now just a reminder on the history of this. This is, it's a land that the indigenous Apache people have used for a long time, but it
Right.
sits actually on federal ground. It's on a national forest. And so, there's permitting processes to use public lands and royalties are paid and so forth. But let's say the Apache people said, listen, not only will the copper mine, violate our religious beliefs, but any non-Apaches cannot be there. This is our land, it's sacred, and so forth. National Forest Service, we want you to not only prohibit the copper mine, but we want you to prohibit any non-Apaches from using this land because it violates our religious belief. Should they be able to do that? In other words, to what extent should an indigenous group's religious beliefs be able to dictate the use of land that's otherwise available under our current licensing programs and on publicly owned lands?
To the extent that it prevents a copper mine from coming onto the indigenous land and completely disregarding indigenous religious faith traditions. To that extent, for sure. The other cases that you propose, non-Apache people, as far as I'm concerned, we can cross that bridge when we get there. But this is way out of bounds.
I just think this case is so is telling because it shows that religious freedom sometimes can be used for what we might call progressive purposes, and sometimes for what you might call conservative purposes. I think most progressives would hear the facts of this case and say, oh, you've got a copper mine against indigenous people, against Native Americans. Of course,
right.
Religious freedom principles here would indicate that the Native Americans ought to win. And I actually agree with them in this case, but I think that sometimes religious freedom and sort of belief in religious freedom redounds to the benefit of progressive sympathies, and sometimes it doesn't. And I think the great thing about religious freedom is that, like other First Amendment rights, it really should have political blinders on. Religious freedom should apply to everyone, progressive or conservative.
But Tim, where do you draw the line, though? I mean, if you start saying that, all right, this is what we feel is something that's spiritual. However, you have a whole group and you're in the midst of an area that actually has federal connotations to it. I mean, it almost sounds like they get to decide what they feel like doing based on what they feel. Can that be the right way to go on this?
Well, that always has to be balanced. And I think this is back to a discussion we've also had, is that the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which is the federal law that's sort of the leading sort of federal policy in this area, doesn't say that the religious freedom claim always wins. It just says that the government has to show that it has a really good reason to override somebody's religious freedom, and that it's not only that they do it, but they do it in a very narrowly tailored way. So it's just that religious freedom is a very weighty and important right. The government can overcome that right, but it has to have a really darn good reason.
Dr. Brown, what's your thoughts?
Sure.
Well, I think that our history with dealing with the first Americans really speaks volumes. We have broken treaties, we have slaughtered, we have ripped children away from their families in an effort to Americanize them. So, our history is not very good here. And for me, looking at this, it just feels like a movie I've watched before.
Todd, it sounds like you had a comment.
Yeah, I mean, again, I just sort of talking this through. I mean, I agree with Tim when it comes to progressive, as far as religious freedom should have blinders on when it comes to sort of the politics of something. I do think, though, it raises questions, though, as far as like, where does the line, especially when you're talking about public lands, there's another mine that's being proposed somewhere out west, and I can't remember where, that has a huge deposit of lithium on it, right? And if you're a progressive, you want lithium mining because you want electrification, you want cars, you want, more batteries and so forth. But yet there's no question it's going to be destructive of the environment there. And also there is Native American concerns there. I don't think it rises quite the same level as this. And so you have to start asking yourself, like, where do you balance these various goals, right? Because mining is by nature a disruptive influence, whether that be to the environment or to religious interests. But on the other hand, if we want to accomplish some other progressive goals, for instance, electrification, move everything away from fossil fuels, that's going to require an upgrade of the grid, which requires copper. It's going to require a whole lot more batteries. That requires lithium. And, it's just hard to know where this all stops. And I do come back, and it's fair enough, Tim or Dr. Golden, to put this off to the sort of, the next scenario. But, if the scenario here was, say, instead of stopping a copper mine, a Christian group felt that this was holy and they needed to erect a cross on this public land, then the progressives would be a whole lot more opposed to that exercise of religious freedom.
Well, and I think you're probably right about that, Todd. And I think that hypothetical you proposed speaks to a lot of things that would have to be fleshed out, because the history, right, the force and the weight of history is frankly, the force and the weight of history is what had so many people on Capitol Hill join forces against the Smith decision, right? You had this indigenous person who smoked peyote, right, and who was sort of left sort of outside of the political process. And I think those competing histories, the history of a Christian group that wants to put up a cross is very different from the history of indigenous people who want to sort of protect their land. So I think in terms of litigation, we have to wait and see, but I think the historical sensibilities are going to play a role whenever that scenario you've articulated happens.
Well, I'm going to tell you, I think when we start looking at capitalism and profit and things of that nature, the fact of the matter is there's always going to be winners and there's always going to be losers. And we've got to figure out what's going to be the right balance. We're not infringing upon, hopefully, somebody's religious beliefs. Well, gentlemen, thank you for being with us today. We enjoyed this conversation. And we got to go through a process where I just want to make sure you guys tell me something I don't know. So, Todd, tell me something I don't know.
My favorite segment on this show. Orlin, I will tell you something you don't know. This is the last segment we're taping today, and I'm very happy about that. It's been a good time.
Tim Schultz, tell me something I don't know.
Well, we've talked a lot today about chaplains. The greatest chaplain in the United States today is the chaplain of the United States Senate, Chaplain Barry Black, former military chaplain, Seventh-day Adventist, and my wife's boss.
Oh, wow. Dr. Brown, tell me something I don't know.
If you are uncomfortable with this whole pronouns issue, and if you're uncomfortable with alphabet soup, LBGT, however many different letters are in there, you probably need to fasten your seatbelt, because it's not going to get any better anytime soon.
Dr. Golden, let's wrap it up with you. Tell me something I don't know.
This show will soon be a tour de force on the cable network scene.
That might be something I do know. Well, thanks a lot, guys, and thanks for being with us today. We want to thank our audience for being with us here today and hope you enjoyed our conversation. And just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.